Have you ever sat in a meeting where, an executive proposes this massive new structural change and the entire room just goes completely silent?
Oh, yeah, that absolute uncomfortable dead silence.
Right. And the manager just looks around, smiles, and says, "Oh, great. Glad we're all on the same page."
Just completely assuming that dead silence means everyone agrees.
Exactly. But think about that for a second.
Yeah.
What would you do in that situation? I mean, would you speak up or would you just nod along while secretly panicking about the new policy?
It is such a universally uncomfortable moment, and honestly, a fantastic scenario to kick off today's
It
discussion.
really is.
While you were thinking about how you'd handle that incredibly tense silence, a very warm welcome to this deep dive. And if you are serious about mastering these high-stakes workplace situations, take a quick second to follow the English Effect podcast.
And subscribe to our YouTube channel, definitely.
Yes, and you will absolutely want to download the free vocabulary companion from the link in the description. It tracks all the nuances of the business expressions we're exploring today, so you can start using them immediately.
Definitely grab that guide because our mission today is breaking down what might just be the ultimate modern business skill.
The big one.
We are looking at emotional intelligence, which is often referred to as your emotional quotient or EQ.
Right.
But we aren't just talking about being polite here.
Mm.
We're using research from Harvard, McKinsey, Deloitte, and Forbes to uncover why EQ is actually a core driver of absolute profitability.
And as we dig into the mechanisms of how this works, we are going to unpack the specific English vocabulary you need to project confidence, true professionalism, and elite interpersonal skills in any global workplace.
What stands out to me immediately in the research is how the very language of business is shifting.
Oh, absolutely. Terms like emotional quotient, professionalism, and interpersonal skills, they are shedding this outdated reputation as just soft skills.
Yes.
Thank goodness. They're now recognized as hard, measurable metrics of operational success.
So let's just dismantle that soft skill myth right now.
Mm.
I hear people dismiss EQ all the time as just, I don't know, singing songs around a campfire or buying donuts for the team.
Right, the pizza party management style.
Exactly. But it is a hard operational metric. Lacking EQ has a massive, measurable financial cost. There's this major report from Business Solver that puts a staggering number on it.
What's the number?
Unempathetic organizations risk $180 billion annually.
Wait, 180 billion.
$180 billion. And that loss is entirely due to people just packing up and leaving.
Wow. That number is almost difficult to wrap your head around. And, if you are navigating a global corporate environment, you wouldn't just call this people leaving.
Right. What's the formal term?
You would use the term attrition. Attrition is the professional measurement of staff turnover. It's not just an empty desk. It's the cost of recruiting, the loss of institutional knowledge, and, well, the slowing down of operations. High attrition basically bleeds a company dry.
Bleeds them dry. And the data shows that employees at unempathetic workplaces are 1.5 times more likely to quit.
Which makes sense.
But it's not just the exit that's the problem. It's the condition of the workplace before they actually hand in their resignation. These same environments report 3 times higher toxicity.
3 times.
Yeah, and a 1.3 times increase in mental health issues.
Which introduces a phrase you hear often but need to use carefully, which is toxic work environment.
How so?
Well, if you're trying to communicate systemic issues to HR, you don't just say, my boss is mean. You describe the structural reality of a toxic work environment, which directly impacts the bottom line.
The bottom line.
Right. And the bottom line isn't just a financial term for profit or loss. It represents the ultimate final result of a company's efforts.
I have to pause here, though, because there's this really bizarre paradox in the data. The same report reveals that 73% of CEOs believe their company is highly empathetic.
Let me guess. The employees disagree.
Vehemently disagree. When you survey the HR professionals and the actual workforce, it's like the C-suite is looking at a completely different company. I mean, how does that happen?
That gap in perception is what we call a disconnect. And in business English, using disconnect as a noun is an incredibly useful diplomatic way to point out a major flaw.
So how would you use it in a meeting?
If you see a strategy that ignores reality, you don't say, well, you're all wrong. You say, I think there is a massive disconnect between our strategy and the daily operations.
That sounds so much more professional.
It does. The leadership genuinely believes they are empathetic because they offer, say, flexible hours. But there is a disconnect with the operational reality of the employees who are just too overworked to ever use those hours.
That makes perfect sense. So if a lack of EQ drives attrition and destroys the bottom line, what does the actual mechanics of EQ look like in action?
especially during big changes, right?
Exactly. This becomes incredibly tangible when a company is facing an existential shift. Think about automation. When a company integrates AI into its production, the workforce is terrified.
Oh, absolutely.
They aren't thinking about efficiency. They're thinking, am I being replaced?
And this is where leadership faces a truly critical test. Because a simple, memo outlining the new software isn't going to calm those fears.
Exactly the opposite. Forbes highlighted this chief information officer at a Midwest industrial machinery company who faced this exact scenario.
What did he do?
He didn't just demand compliance. He used a highly structured EQ approach. So he provided the technical training, sure, but he paired it with targeted emotional support systems to actively address the workforce's anxieties.
Wow.
He essentially engineered a way to keep their brains from panicking.
So he avoided what we call top-down management.
Yes,
For you listening, top-down management is when decisions are dictated from the executives and just forced onto the employees without any consultation.
Which never works well.
Never. Fast Company actually published a piece explicitly warning that silence is not alignment. Going back to our opening scenario, if a manager assumes that a quiet room means everyone agrees, they are making a fatal error.
Let me introduce an analogy here. Leading a team through a crisis is a lot like driving a high-performance car. Your intelligence, your IQ, is the engine. It gives you power.
Okay, I like this.
But your EQ is the suspension system. If you try to take a sharp turn at 90 miles an hour without suspension, the car is going to flip.
That is a great visual.
That's what happens when a brilliant executive tries to force a mandate without emotional intelligence. The team physically cannot process the change.
And that inability to process is deeply biological, actually. Art in coaching points to a phenomenon known as the amygdala hijack.
Amygdala hijack.
Yes. When we feel threatened, whether by a physical predator or, a sudden corporate restructuring our brain's emotional center, the amygdala literally takes control.
So we just stop thinking logically.
Exactly. We bypass logic entirely and default to impulsive, defensive fight-or-flight responses.
And the McKinsey research expands on this beautifully. Richard Boyatzis, who is a prominent scholar, demonstrated that under even mild stress, our peripheral vision literally drops from 180 degrees down to 30 degrees.
Wait, literally?
Literally. Our cognitive function drops, we physically develop tunnel vision, and cannot see the big picture.
We are biologically incapable of seeing the nuance. Furthermore, McKinsey notes that leaders function as emotional contagions.
Like a virus.
Exactly like a virus. If a leader walks into a room radiating panic or aggression, the team catches that emotion. So if you are listening to this and wondering how to prevent that contagion, you really have to look at your phrasing.
So what's the alternative to that awful manager who says, great, glad we're all on the same page?
You need to secure alignment, which we also call getting buy-in.
Yeah.
Right. This means everyone genuinely understands and supports the execution of the plan. Instead of asking, does anyone have a problem with this?
Yeah.
Which immediately triggers an amygdala hijack because it sounds like a threat.
Oh, totally. It sounds super aggressive.
Right. So instead, you use phrasing that invites collaboration. You say, I want to ensure we have true alignment on this. What concerns do we need to address before moving forward?
I love that.
You are actively inviting the pushback before it becomes a problem.
That phrasing completely dismantles the fear. It creates safety. And we see the opposite of this with return to office or RTO mandates.
Oh, RTO mandates are such a hot topic right now.
Huge. Business Solver notes that rigid RTO mandates fracture trust entirely. Why? Because it's the ultimate top-down move. It strips away autonomy, triggers the amygdala, and creates an instant disconnect between leadership and the workforce.
So we see how crucial EQ is for managing a team internally. But how does this translate externally?
Wait, I have to challenge this premise for a second.
Okay, challenge away.
Managing a team with EQ makes perfect sense to me. But what about a high-stakes, ruthless negotiation? If a supplier is trying to crush my budget, isn't focusing on their feelings just going to make me look weak?
That is such a common fear.
Right. We have this cinematic image of, table-pounding negotiator who wins by intimidating the other side.
Well, that image is entirely fiction, according to the data. The Harvard Program on Negotiation conducted this really fascinating study measuring general mental ability, essentially IQ, against actual negotiation outcomes.
The results were wild.
Completely wild. IQ did not correlate with better outcomes.
So being the smartest person in the room didn't matter.
Nope. Being the smartest, most logical person didn't win the deal. The negotiators who achieved the highest outcomes were the ones with superior emotion recognition and emotional understanding.
That is incredible.
They achieved what Harvard calls joint gains. And if you are negotiating in English, joint gains is a much more sophisticated way of describing a win-win outcome. It means you've structured a deal where both parties extract significant, measurable value.
But how does emotion recognition actually achieve that? Let's say the other side is digging their heels in on a massive price increase. If I can recognize that they aren't just being greedy, but they are actually expressing profound anxiety about an upcoming quarterly deadline, that changes the entire dynamic.
Exactly.
I can adjust my offer to alleviate their timeline anxiety, and in return, they drop the price. We both get what we need. Joint gains.
We see this exact mechanism mirrored in the International Journal of Integrated Research and Practice study. This one focused on cross-cultural teams.
Oh, that adds a whole new layer of complexity.
It does. When you are engaged in cross-cultural communication, navigating different geographical, linguistic, and cultural backgrounds, empathy and social awareness are the primary tools for overcoming friction.
Let's role-play this for the listener. Imagine you're in a tense international meeting. The partner makes a demand that completely wrecks your operational budget. The instinct is to fight back,
Right. The amygdala screams at you to say, you are being completely unreasonable.
which instantly shuts down the negotiation.
Exactly. Instead, you need to de-escalate the situation. To de-escalate means to intentionally lower the emotional intensity of a conflict.
Okay, how do we do that?
You use active listening to validate their concern, and then you offer professional pushback. Pushback is a polite but firm resistance to an idea.
So what does that actually sound like in practice? What would you say?
Instead of hostility, you might say, I understand your position on the timeline. However, given our budgetary constraints, we will need to explore alternative structures to make this work.
That is so smooth.
Notice the structure there. You validate their reality first, which calms the amygdala, and then you firmly hold your boundary.
So if we connect the dots here, we know EQ prevents costly attrition. We know it secures joint gains in negotiations. But what is the underlying architecture of this? Researchers constantly use the term psychological safety.
Psychological safety is arguably the most important metric of modern team dynamics.
It's everywhere right now.
It is an environment where employees feel secure enough to take calculated risks, voice dissenting opinions, and admit mistakes without the fear of humiliation or retaliation.
Deloitte identified 6 enduring human capabilities, and their research proves this out. They found that high-performing teams with high EQ are significantly more likely to trust each other.
What were the numbers on that?
We are talking 65% trust in high EQ teams versus a dismal 28% of low-performing teams.
Wow. But that trust isn't just some magical aura, you know? It is built through highly specific language. The British Council outlines what they call the language of EQ.
The language of EQ.
Yes, and interestingly, it is heavily dependent on grammar. It involves a fundamental shift from blaming statements to accountable statements.
Let's break that down. Suppose someone on your team is constantly missing deadlines, and it's causing a bottleneck for your entire department.
The low EQ amygdala-driven response is a blaming statement, which almost always starts with the word you.
Like you are always late.
Exactly. You are always late with these reports. You are dragging the team down. In English, starting a piece of feedback with you instantly makes the listener defensive.
It feels like an attack.
It does. The language of EQ requires labeling your own experience and taking responsibility. So a high EQ leader uses an I statement.
Like saying, I feel anxious about our project timeline when these deliverables are delayed. How can we get this back on track?
Exactly. It is a subtle grammatical shift, but a hugely powerful psychological one. You are still delivering constructive feedback, which is feedback specifically intended to help someone improve their performance, but you are attacking the problem, not their character.
And art coaching stresses that you absolutely cannot skip these conversations.
Yeah.
Delivering constructive feedback is the hallmark of leadership. Avoidance is what corrodes trust.
So true.
If you just silently resent the person who is late, you destroy the team's cohesion.
When leaders avoid hard conversations, they create silos.
Silos are the worst.
For our listeners, a silo is a terrible organizational structure where departments or individuals operate completely isolated from one another. They stop sharing information, they stop collaborating, and crucially, they stop taking responsibility.
Fast Company points out that allowing silos to form is a massive failure of EQ.
To see the opposite of a silo, look at the famous story Amy Edmondson shares in the McKinsey piece.
Oh, the NASA story. I love this one.
It's so good. It's about a janitor at NASA in the 1960s. When a visitor asked him what his job was, he didn't say, "I mop the floors." He said, "I'm helping put a man on the moon."
That level of alignment doesn't just happen by accident. That happens because a leader, using immense emotional intelligence, actively connected a daily mundane task to a grand, overarching vision.
That leader used the language of EQ to make that individual feel essential to the mission.
Okay, so we've established that EQ is a superpower. But let's look at the dark side of this for a minute.
The dark side of empathy.
Yeah. If you're constantly managing everyone's emotions, validating their fears, and de-escalating conflicts, doesn't this become exhausting? At some point, you still have to do your actual job.
You've hit on a critical vulnerability there. Empathy without boundaries is a fast track to self-destruction. Kelly Thompson, who is featured in the Business Solver report, issues a stark warning about this.
Why? What did she say?
She argues that leaders who try to absorb everyone's stress fall into the trap of overfunctioning.
Overfunctioning. That is a brilliant way to describe it.
It really is. It means taking on responsibilities, emotional or practical, that actually belong to someone else. And it's usually driven by a desire to fix their problems.
So that's dangerous.
Very, because the inevitable result of overfunctioning is burnout, a state of total physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion where you simply cannot operate anymore.
You see this constantly with newly promoted managers. Someone on their team is struggling with a spreadsheet. Instead of coaching them, which takes time and forces the employee to struggle a bit, the manager just says, "Give it to me, I'll fix it."
Yes, the classic trap.
They think they are being empathetic, but they are actually disempowering the employee and marching themselves straight toward burnout.
Which is why you must master the skill of setting boundaries. In business English, setting boundaries means clearly and professionally communicating what you will and will not accept, or what you actually have the capacity to do.
So how do you do that without sounding like a jerk?
Well, if someone brings you a problem you shouldn't be solving, you don't just say, "I don't have time for this." You maintain your EQ by saying, "I understand you're facing challenges with this task. I can offer 15 minutes to review your strategy, but I need you to lead the execution."
So you are being supportive, but you are requiring them to take responsibility.
Exactly.
You have to walk the talk. You can't just preach the theory of EQ. You have to put it into sustainable practice.
Walking the talk is essential, especially as we look toward the future. And speaking of the future, we need to address the MIT Sloan research on emotion AI.
Oh, man. This is where the intersection of human empathy and technology gets a bit dystopian.
Deeply unsettling, honestly.
MIT Sloan highlights how artificial intelligence is actively being trained to read and respond to human emotions. It's being deployed in marketing, customer service, and healthcare.
It's everywhere.
The software analyzes your vocal tone, tracks your facial microexpressions through a camera, and algorithmically determines if you are confused, frustrated, or satisfied.
Which raises profound questions about authenticity in the workplace. I mean, if a machine can perfectly calibrate an empathetic response to bypass your amygdala, what does that mean for human interaction?
It is an incredible irony. We have a workforce dealing with unprecedented burnout because human beings are struggling to manage emotions. And simultaneously, we have tech companies building algorithms to automate empathy.
While humans are burning out, machines are learning to care.
Exactly. And this is all unfolding against a backdrop of massive existential fatigue. Fast Company cited a statistic that over 80% of U.S. workers are considering leaving the country entirely.
80%.
Yeah, citing the cost of living and the decline in their quality of life.
That is a staggering metric. It reveals a truly desperate workforce. People are searching for environments where they feel valued, supported, and psychologically safe, things they clearly are not finding in their current unempathetic work environments.
They are fleeing the toxic work environments. They are desperately trying to escape the disconnect between what executives say and what they actually do.
So if we synthesize all of this from avoiding the amygdala hijack and engineering joint gains in a negotiation to setting firm boundaries so you don't overfunction, the ultimate goal is to become a leader who communicates with absolute intention.
And that brings us perfectly back to that silent meeting room we opened with. The manager who looks at a room full of dead silence and assumes everyone is perfectly aligned.
Oh, that manager completely lacks the EQ to recognize that their team is frozen in a 30-degree tunnel vision.
They have no idea how to use the language of psychological safety to invite the pushback they desperately need.
Because they are relying on a top-down mandate rather than doing the hard work to build genuine alignment.
Which leads us with a final, slightly provocative thought for you to mull over as you navigate your own career. As we look toward this rapidly approaching future of emotion AI,
Yeah.
a future where an algorithm might actually be mathematically better at reading the micro-expressions of your colleagues than you are, will empathy just become another automated metric on a corporate dashboard?
Imagine logging in and seeing your team's automated empathy score has dropped 12% this quarter.
Exactly. Or, on the flip side, is the slightly messy, sometimes awkward, deeply authentic human effort of just trying to understand a colleague, even when you use the wrong words or stumble through the feedback,
Mhm.
is that inherently human effort the only thing that actually builds real trust?
That is a phenomenal question to leave you with.
I think so too.
If you found today's deep dive valuable and want to continue mastering the language of global business, please make sure you follow the podcast and subscribe to The English Effect on YouTube.
And do not forget to download your free vocabulary companion from the description.
Yes, so you can review all the expressions we covered today, share this deep dive with a colleague who wants to elevate their business English and their emotional intelligence. Until next time, keep learning and keep leading.